What happens when trust is shattered and love turns into betrayal? Claire asks her husband for an open marriage, but Nate agrees with a condition she never expected. As secrets unfold, a dangerous game begins. Will their love survive the truth, or will it crumble under the weight of betrayal? Watch as their lives unravel, one choice, one lie, one heartbreak at a time. You won't believe the shocking twist that changes everything. Are you ready to discover the truth? Stay tuned. Nate McAllister had always believed his marriage to Claire was unbreakable. The foundation of their love was built on trust, loyalty, and years of shared experiences. Yet here he was, staring at her across the dinner table, feeling as if the ground beneath him had shifted. "Would you ever consider an open marriage?" Claire asked, her voice steady but edged with uncertainty. Her eyes met his, searching, waiting for a response. Nate froze, fork halfway to his mouth. He had misheard her. Surely this couldn't be real. They had always been close, always communicated about everything. What was she saying now? The words felt like a slap across his face. "What?" His voice was hoarse, the question more of a reflex than a conscious thought. Claire shifted in her seat, her fingers tracing the edge of her wine glass nervously. "I've been thinking about it for a while now," she continued. "I feel like we've drifted apart, like we're living separate lives. I need more, something more than just this routine." Nate felt a cold wave wash over him. He couldn't process it. More? What did that even mean? He looked at Claire, really looked at her. Her eyes were downcast, avoiding his, as if she couldn't bear to see the confusion, or worse, the hurt, in his face. It wasn't just a suggestion. It was a plea, a silent cry for something he didn't even know how to give. "You're serious?" Nate asked, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. He had always prided himself on being open-minded, understanding. But this was uncharted territory. Claire finally met his gaze, her eyes filled with vulnerability. "I don't want to lose you, Nate, but I don't know if this is enough anymore. I need freedom, the kind we don't have in this marriage, something we can't give each other." Nate felt his chest tighten. He had never imagined they'd reach this point. Claire had always been his anchor, his partner, the woman he trusted more than anyone else. And yet, here she was, laying out a request that made him question everything they had built. He put his fork down, the food suddenly tasteless. His mind raced, but his thoughts felt tangled. Could he accept this? Could he truly allow Claire the freedom she was asking for without losing himself in the process? "I don't know if I can," Nate admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can handle sharing you." Claire's face fell, and Nate felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on his own shock, his own hurt, that he hadn't truly listened to her. But how could he? The idea of her with someone else, physically, emotionally, felt like a betrayal, even though she was still sitting right in front of him. "I don't want to hurt you, Nate," Claire said softly, her voice shaking slightly. "But I need this. I need to feel alive again. I'm suffocating in this marriage. I love you, but I need more." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating in their own right. Nate swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had always been the one who kept things together, who held on to the past and made sure they never strayed. But this was different. Claire's eyes searched his for an answer, for a sign that he would agree, that he would understand. "I can't just say yes to this," Nate said, his voice firm now. "If we do this, there's no going back. It will change everything. Are you ready for that?" She nodded, the resolve in her eyes replacing the fear. "Yes, I am." Nate exhaled deeply, his heart racing. Could he really agree to this? Could he let go of everything they had built? He sat back in his chair, the room feeling smaller, the walls closing in. He had no answers, no solutions. But he knew one thing for sure. Agreeing to this would be the hardest decision of his life. The days following Claire's confession felt like they stretched endlessly before Nate. Each moment with her was filled with an undercurrent of tension, like walking on a fragile surface that could crack at any second. He had agreed to her request for an open marriage, but the condition he set hung between them like an unspoken promise, one that neither of them fully understood the consequences of. They sat across from each other at the dinner table again, the uneaten food a symbol of the silence that had descended over them. Nate stared at Claire, his thoughts spinning. The weight of his words, the condition he had placed on their marriage, felt like a heavy chain wrapped around his chest. "You're sure about this?" Nate asked quietly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the evening. The question was simple, but it was laced with so much more. "Are you ready for the consequences? Are you ready for me to know everything?" Claire looked down at her plate, pushing the food around with her fork, not meeting his eyes. "I think so," she replied, her voice shaky but determined. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine when I feel suffocated." Nate's heart twisted at her words. He understood her pain, the quiet desperation in her voice, but at the same time there was something about this arrangement that felt wrong, something about it that threatened to tear everything they had built apart. "I just don't know if I can handle it," Nate admitted, the words escaping before he could stop them. "You say no secrets, but what if I can't stand to know everything? What if the truth breaks me?" Claire's eyes finally met his, and for a brief moment they both shared the same vulnerability. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to hurt you, Nate, but I need this. I need something that's mine, and I need to feel alive again." Nate stared at her, his mind racing. Alive again? What did she mean by that? Was it something he had failed to give her? Or was it something deeper? Something that only this open marriage could satisfy? "I can't promise that it won't hurt," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But if you're going to do this, Claire, I need to know everything, every detail. No hiding, no lies." Claire nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and apprehension. "I understand, I promise." But even as she spoke, Nate could see the uncertainty flicker in her gaze. He knew this wouldn't be easy for either of them. How could it be? She was asking for something so drastic, so against everything they had ever stood for. A long silence passed between them as the weight of the condition settled over the dinner table. Nate wondered if they could ever go back to being the people they once were. Could he truly handle the raw truth? Could he survive the emotional toll of knowing that Claire would be with someone else? Possibly even more than once? "I need time to process this," Nate said, pushing his plate away. His appetite had disappeared, replaced by a storm of emotions he couldn't name. "I need to think." Claire's face fell slightly, but she didn't argue. "I know, I don't expect you to have all the answers right now. I just needed you to understand why I asked for this." Nate stood up from the table, his mind still whirling. He walked toward the window, looking out into the night. The city lights of Austin flickered like distant stars, but they didn't offer him any comfort. His thoughts were consumed with the question of whether he could live with what Claire was asking. Could he handle this? Could they both survive it? Claire joined him by the window, standing just behind him. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," she said softly, her hand reaching out to touch his shoulder. I just want to feel something again, something real." Nate closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words sink in. He wanted to understand. He wanted to be the husband who could give her everything she needed. But was that enough? Was he willing to open himself to the possibility of pain, of losing her even in this new arrangement? "I need some time," Nate repeated, his voice barely audible. He needed time to think, to process everything. He needed time to figure out if he could handle the truth, or if it would destroy him. Claire sat at the bar, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass, her thoughts swirling like the ice inside. The dim lighting of the bar, with its hum of conversation and clinking glasses, should have been comforting, but it only amplified the weight pressing on her chest. She was here, alone, a few steps away from the decision that had been gnawing at her for weeks. She had come to Austin to escape the suffocating routine of her life, to breathe again, to feel something other than the heaviness of the marriage she was in. Claire had promised Nate she would be honest, but now, as the reality of the open marriage they had agreed upon sank in, she wondered whether this would be enough, or if she would end up destroying the very thing she was trying to save. The door to the bar opened, and a tall figure stepped in, Tim. His eyes scanned the room until they locked with hers. Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. There was an electric pull between them, something she couldn't explain, but it was undeniable. He flashed her a grin as he walked over, the tension in her body easing slightly. "You look like you're lost in thought," Tim said, his voice smooth and casual as he slid onto the stool beside her. "I guess I am," Claire replied, her voice soft, almost reluctant. She didn't want to talk about the whirlwind of emotions she'd been carrying with her, but something about Tim made it easier to just exist in the moment. He was a stranger, someone who didn't know the weight of her past, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could just breathe. "Want to talk about it?" Tim asked, leaning in slightly, his eyes sincere but playful. Claire hesitated for a moment, then shook her head, a faint laugh escaping her lips. "I don't even know where to start." Tim smiled, his gaze never leaving hers. "Well, maybe you don't need to talk. We can just enjoy the night." Claire felt herself drawn in by his energy. He was easy to talk to, but more than that, he made her feel seen. As the conversation flowed, she found herself letting go of the guilt that had been gnawing at her. Nate had asked for transparency, for honesty, but did that mean she had to keep every feeling locked inside? Or was it okay to let someone else share the burden of her restlessness? "Let me buy you another drink," Tim suggested, his hand already reaching for the bartender. "Sure," Claire replied, her heart beating a little faster than usual. Was it the alcohol, or was it him? The night wore on, the air between them thick with unspoken thoughts. By the time they were on their third round, Claire was no longer thinking about Nate, about the open marriage, or the promises she had made. She was here, in the moment, with someone who made her feel wanted in a way she hadn't felt in years. Tim's hand brushed against hers, a casual touch that sent a spark of heat racing through her body. "You're beautiful," he said quietly, leaning closer, "and I think you know it." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She had heard compliments before, but this one felt different, real, intimate. A part of her, the part of her that had been starved for affection, wanted to lean into it. But another part of her, the part that still felt tethered to Nate, fought to hold back. "I shouldn't," Claire murmured, but the words felt hollow, more like an excuse than a boundary. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," Tim said, his voice low, almost hypnotic. "But you deserve to feel alive again, Claire." The words hit her harder than she expected. Alive again. That was what she had been chasing, wasn't it? She had loved Nate, still loved him, but somewhere along the way, the spark had dimmed. She hadn't realized how desperately she needed someone to make her feel like she mattered, like she was more than just a wife or a mother or a partner. Tim's lips hovered near her ear as he whispered, "You're not just a wife. You're a woman who deserves more." In that moment, Claire felt the pull, the temptation. She was standing on the edge of something new, something that promised to make her feel more than she had in years. But as she looked at Tim, so close, so eager, a pang of guilt shot through her. She had made promises to Nate. They had agreed on transparency, on openness. But was this it? Was this the start of something that would break everything? For a brief second, she thought about backing away, about calling it off. But then, Tim's lips brushed against hers, a soft, lingering kiss that left her breathless. What harm could it do, she thought. This is what we agreed upon. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the living room as Nate sat in his favorite chair. He was supposed to be working, but his mind was elsewhere. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was off with Claire, something more than just her being distant. The nagging thought that had been lurking in the back of his mind for days, weeks even, finally pushed him to action. Nate had never been the type to snoop. Trust had always been the foundation of his marriage, the one thing he believed would never waver. But now his hands trembled as he picked up Claire's phone from the coffee table. She'd left it there, unattended, while she took a quick shower. The screen unlocked with a simple touch, and for a moment Nate hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, or if he was even hoping to find anything at all. But curiosity gnawed at him, and the silence of the room felt deafening, as though it were urging him to look, to know. His eyes flicked to the messages first. Nothing out of the ordinary at first glance. Just work updates and a few texts from friends. But as he scrolled down, his heart skipped a beat. The name Tim appeared in several threads, most recently a few hours ago. Tim, the bar owner from downtown Austin, the one Claire had met during their last night out without him. The one she'd mentioned briefly in passing, but never in detail. A name that had lingered like a shadow in the back of his mind. Nate clicked on the conversation, his fingers moving mechanically. His breath caught as he saw the words. They weren't just friendly exchanges. No, these messages were intimate, charged with something deeper, something more. Tim had sent her a picture, a photo of the two of them laughing together, their faces inches apart. Another message followed. "I miss you already." His stomach twisted into knots as he read the rest. More flirtations, more coded messages. A few sentences stood out, as though they were meant to pierce through the veil of his ignorance. "I can't wait for tonight. Just you and me." The room felt like it was closing in on him. Every word, every sentence, seared through him like a hot blade. Nate's breath came in shallow gasps, his fingers hovering over the phone, unsure of whether he wanted to keep reading or slam it down in disbelief. This wasn't just an affair, it was something more, something Claire had been hiding, something that went deeper than their agreement for an open marriage. Did she really mean it when she said she loved me? The question cut into him like a wound that refused to heal. Nate's mind raced. The weight of the discovery made his head spin. He had always prided himself on being a patient, understanding husband, one who would try to listen before jumping to conclusions. But now? Now, the rules felt irrelevant. There was no mistaking the depth of her feelings for Tim, no pretending that everything was fine. He stood up abruptly, the phone still in his hands, his pulse hammering in his ears. He couldn't just sit there anymore, couldn't pretend that the silent tension between them was something he could ignore. He needed answers. The sound of the shower stopped, and Claire's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Nate's heart pounded as he turned, bracing himself for the inevitable confrontation. He felt sick, his hands clammy, but he knew he couldn't let this go any longer. He had to face it, whatever the cost. As Claire stepped into the room, toweling off her hair, she smiled at him. A soft, almost apologetic smile that she often gave when she felt guilty about something. But this time it felt different. It felt like a mask, something that could no longer cover the truth. "Hey," she said, her voice light as if nothing had changed. "What's going on?" Nate didn't answer. He held up the phone, the screen facing her. "Who's Tim?" His voice came out colder than he intended, but the words were out before he could stop them. Claire froze. For the briefest moment, her eyes widened, then quickly masked the shock with a forced calmness. It's not what you think, Nate," she started, but the crack in her voice betrayed her. "I swear, it wasn't supposed to be like this." Nate's eyes narrowed, the betrayal raw and evident on his face. "What is it then, Claire? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been hiding something from me, something more than just a freedom you asked for." His voice cracked with frustration, the sting of her secret cutting deeper than any words could convey. Claire opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence between them was deafening. Nate could see the shame in her eyes, the guilt, but it did nothing to stop the anger bubbling up inside him. "I need answers, Claire, now." The silence hung heavily in the room, suffocating them both. Nate stood there, phone in hand, staring at Claire, who still hadn't said a word. Her eyes darted to the ground, unable to meet his. She wasn't even trying to defend herself anymore. "Who is he, Claire?" Nate's voice trembled with anger and hurt. "Tell me the truth, right now." Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. The guilt in her eyes was undeniable, but it wasn't enough. Nate's heart ached, but the hurt was quickly turning into something darker, something deeper. How long had she been lying to him? How long had he been living in a world that wasn't real? "I didn't want to hurt you," Claire finally whispered, her voice cracking. "It just happened. I didn't plan for it to go this far, Nate." Nate's fist tightened around the phone. His knuckles went white as his frustration boiled over. "You didn't plan for it?" He scoffed bitterly. "You think I don't see through this? You asked for an open marriage, Claire. You made the choice. You didn't have to do this." Claire took a step back, her face flushed with shame, but her shoulders were slumped with defeat. I know, but it wasn't like that. I was trying to feel something, anything. I didn't mean for it to go this far. You were never there, Nate. You were always working, always busy, and I just wanted to feel alive again." The words hit Nate like a slap. His chest tightened as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "Alive again? Is that what you think this is? That sleeping with another man will make you feel alive?" His voice broke, raw and filled with pain. "You've shattered everything, Claire. You didn't just want freedom. You wanted someone else. You didn't care about the promises we made." Claire's hands trembled as she wiped her eyes, trying to steady herself, but the tears kept coming. She had never seen Nate like this, never heard the raw anguish in his voice. It was as if the entire weight of their relationship had collapsed in on them both. "I'm sorry, Nate. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you, but you were never around. I felt invisible. I felt like I didn't matter." Her voice dropped to a whisper as if she couldn't even bring herself to say it louder. "I needed something. Someone. I thought maybe this would make me feel whole again." Nate shook his head, disbelief flooding his senses. He had always known their marriage was going through a rough patch, but to hear her admit it so openly, so shamelessly, hurt more than he ever imagined. Invisible? He had given her everything he could. How could she say that? His voice was almost a growl as he spoke. "You needed someone else? What happened to us, Claire? We were supposed to be partners. You think this is the way to fix things? You're asking me to accept you being with someone else, and now you're telling me you didn't mean to hurt me? This destroys me. It tears me apart." Claire's breath hitched. She looked at him, her expression pleading for him to understand, to forgive her, to somehow make this right. But Nate was beyond that point. He couldn't fix this. "Why, Claire?" Nate asked, his voice softer now but still pained. "Why him? Why Tim? You could have told me anything. We could have worked through it, tried to fix things, but you didn't. You hid it from me, and that's what hurts the most." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but paused, her lips trembling. She hadn't been honest with herself, much less Nate. She had justified it, thought it was an escape. But there was no escape from the truth. Not anymore. I thought I could get away with it," she whispered, defeated. "I thought it wouldn't matter. I never meant for you to find out like this." Nate's eyes burned with unshed tears, but he couldn't cry. Not yet. "You thought you could get away with it? You thought you could betray me and not face the consequences?" The anger surged again. "I trusted you, Claire. I trusted you." Claire stepped forward, desperate now. "Please, Nate. I never meant to destroy everything we had. I'm so sorry. But Nate held up his hand, stopping her. His eyes met hers, fierce and unyielding. "I don't want your apologies. I want you to understand what you've done, what we've lost. There's no going back from this, Claire. You can't just undo the hurt." The silence between them was suffocating. Claire looked at him, her chest heaving as she tried to process everything that had just been said, but Nate was done. "I need space," he said quietly, his voice steady, though the pain still cut deep. "I need to think. I need to figure out what happens next. But don't think for a second that I'm going to pretend everything's fine. This isn't just a mistake we can fix. This changes everything." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving Claire standing in the living room, crushed by the weight of her own choices. The silence in the house felt heavier than it ever had before. Claire had left for work that morning, but Nate couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted between them. It wasn't just the discovery of her affair. It was everything that had followed. The betrayal, the anger, the words that couldn't be unsaid. He had tried to make sense of it, tried to keep his emotions in check, but now, as the days stretched on, the wound deepened. He had asked for space, but space didn't seem to calm him. It only made the bitterness worse. So instead of sitting in the empty house waiting for Claire to come home, Nate decided to take action. He started reaching out to old friends, people he hadn't seen in years. He needed a distraction, and perhaps, if he was honest, he wanted to make Claire jealous. The first call was easy. "Hey, it's Nate. You still in Austin?" It had been years since he'd spoken to Allison, a woman he had once had a brief fling with during a business trip. They had stayed friends afterward, but their connection had always been flirtatious, sometimes bordering on more. Allison picked up the phone with a cheerful, familiar voice. "Nate! Long time no talk. What's up?" They spent the next few minutes catching up, but the conversation was never really about catching up. It was about testing the waters, seeing how far Nate could push things without really stepping over the line. They made plans to meet for drinks later that week. Nate hung up, feeling a rush of satisfaction. He hadn't felt this alive in weeks, and part of him hated how much he enjoyed the feeling. Part of him hated how much power it gave him, knowing that he was making Claire uncomfortable by simply existing in this space between them. But as he thought about it, the taste of that power grew sweeter. By the time Claire got home that evening, Nate was already deep in his plan. He had taken a few calls, made a few arrangements, and decided that the evening would be spent on his terms. He wasn't going to sit idly by while Claire had all the freedom she asked for. Claire walked in through the door, her eyes scanning the room as usual. She hesitated for a moment when she saw Nate sitting on the couch, his phone in hand, a faint smile on his lips. It wasn't the smile of a man in pain. It wasn't the smile of a man who had just been betrayed. No, it was the smile of someone who was taking control again, someone who had figured out how to make the game work in his favor. "Hi," she said softly, closing the door behind her. "Hey," Nate replied, putting his phone down and meeting her gaze. "I was just thinking, I'm going out tonight." Claire blinked, surprised. "Out? Where?" "Just meeting up with some old friends. Nothing serious," Nate said, the words coming easily. He didn't feel the need to explain himself further. It wasn't necessary. He could already see the tension building in her face, the subtle flash of insecurity that only came when she was forced to confront what she had done. Her eyes narrowed. "What friends?" Nate's lips curled into a smile that was more playful than kind. "Allison, we're just grabbing drinks." Claire stood frozen, the weight of the name hanging between them. Allison. She knew that name. It wasn't just a friend to Nate. It had always been someone she felt uneasy about, someone who had always lingered in the background, too close for comfort. "You're seeing her?" Claire asked, her voice a mixture of surprise and something else. Something deeper, more cutting. "Yeah," Nate answered, his voice calm, but his eyes were locked on hers. "Why, is that a problem?" Claire didn't answer immediately. She shifted uncomfortably, but Nate could see her discomfort was more than just the shock of him going out. It was the realization that she wasn't the only one who could take control of their lives. She wasn't the only one with the power to make the other feel jealous, to make the other feel unsteady. "I didn't think you'd go out with someone like her," Claire muttered, her voice strained. Nate's heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't from pain. It was from the rush of satisfaction that surged through him. He leaned back on the couch, watching Claire with a look that felt both calculating and triumphant. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, keeping his tone casual, but there was an edge to his voice now. Claire's jaw clenched, and she stepped back, shaking her head. "I just didn't think you'd do this. After everything, I'm doing what you wanted, Claire," Nate said, his words dripping with a quiet intensity. "You wanted an open marriage. Well, I'm taking my turn now." Her eyes darted to the door, and for a second Nate saw the conflict there, the part of her that was still holding on to their shared history, the part of her that hadn't quite accepted what she had done, but it was too late. The game had already begun. "You really want to play this game, Nate?" Claire asked, her voice quieter now, the hurt seeping in. Nate didn't hesitate. "I don't want to play, Claire. I'm just taking back what's mine." Claire opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came. She was defeated, and Nate could see that she knew it. She had initiated this, and now she had to live with the consequences. As she turned to walk away, Nate watched her go, his heart pounding in his chest. He had taken the first step into the game, and now there was no going back. The quiet of the house felt deafening. Claire stood in the kitchen, staring at the sink, her hands frozen on the dishes she hadn't been able to finish washing. Nate had left earlier, a cold farewell that hadn't even reached her ears. It had been more than just the slam of a door. It had been the sound of their marriage starting to splinter, breaking in places she wasn't sure could be fixed. She had expected anger, even resentment, but nothing had prepared her for the coldness. The silence between them had become unbearable. Nate wasn't just angry, he was distant, shutting himself off from her entirely. Every word felt forced, every touch felt like an obligation, not a connection. She hadn't expected him to start playing the same game she had started. It was the last thing she wanted. Yet here she was, standing in the ruins of her own choices, her mind racing as she replayed the last few days. Nate went out with Allison. That's where everything had begun to spiral. Claire had tried to act nonchalant, telling herself that it was just a drink between friends. But it stung in ways she hadn't anticipated. The thought of Nate with someone else, even in this detached, casual context, was suffocating. The guilt gnawed at her, the ache of knowing what she had done to him. She had wanted freedom, but now, as the days dragged on, she realized that what she had truly lost was trust. There was no getting that back. The door clicked open and she turned, her heart dropping into her stomach. Nate stepped in, not looking at her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. "Where have you been?" Claire asked before she could stop herself, her voice tinged with an edge of desperation she hadn't meant to reveal. Nate looked at her briefly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before he turned away and grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. "I don't feel like talking right now." His words, the way he said them, were enough to pierce through her. It wasn't just the cold tone, it was the complete avoidance. The anger had been replaced with indifference, and that was worse than any fight they had ever had. She couldn't take it anymore. "Nate, please," she said, her voice trembling now. "Talk to me. I need to understand what's happening between us. You're acting like I'm invisible. What do you want from me?" Nate sighed, a sound of exasperation. He set the water down on the counter and turned to face her, but he didn't approach her. He stayed rooted in place, staring at her as if trying to gauge how much of the truth she could handle. "I don't know what you want me to say, Claire," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "You made your choice. You wanted freedom. Now you have it. I'm just trying to deal with what you've done to us." Claire's chest tightened as if she couldn't breathe. This wasn't the confrontation she had expected. This wasn't the fight for their marriage. This was something worse. This was the slow, painful process of watching everything fall apart. "Do you even care about me anymore?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. It was as if a dam had broken inside her. She was done pretending that she wasn't hurting, that she didn't need him to fight for her. Nate looked at her, his face unreadable. "Of course I care, but I don't know what you want me to do with that. You've made your bed, Claire. I'm not going to just lay in it with you. I can't." The words stung, leaving her breathless. She had thought, maybe naively, that there was still a chance for them, if only they could talk. If only she could show him how much she regretted her actions. But there was no way back now. The damage had been done. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the apology felt empty. She had apologized so many times in the past few days, but it didn't seem to change anything. Every time she tried to reach out, he pulled away more. "I'm done, Claire," Nate said quietly. His voice was almost resigned, as if he had accepted the end long before she had. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. There was nothing left to say. The silence between them stretched out, thick with unspoken regrets and failures. Claire felt the weight of it all, the weight of the lies, the broken promises, and the realization that their marriage, the one she had fought so hard to protect, was slipping through her fingers. She was losing him, and this time there was no way to get him back. "I'm not going to fight for something that isn't there anymore," Nate continued, his voice quiet but firm. "I can't do this anymore." Claire wanted to scream, wanted to beg him to stay, to fight, but all that came out was a choked sob. The words she had always used to reassure him now felt hollow. Nate turned away, walking toward the door. He didn't look back. The finality of his movements, each step taking him further away from her, sealed the truth she had been unwilling to face. It was over. Nate's mind buzzed as he sat in his car, parked just outside of Tim's bar. The streetlights outside flickered in the dim haze of the night, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He hadn't planned on coming here tonight, but the weight of Claire's betrayal had dragged him to this point. He needed answers, and somehow, confronting Tim felt like the only way to stop the chaos that was consuming him from the inside out. He stepped out of the car, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked towards the bar, the rhythmic thumping of the music inside vibrated through the walls, matching the erratic beat of his pulse. He paused at the door, his hand lingering on the handle, wondering for a moment if he was truly ready to face what awaited him on the other side. But there was no turning back. This had to be done. The door creaked open and Nate stepped inside, the low murmur of conversation hitting him like a wave. His eyes quickly scanned the room, landing on Tim, who was behind the bar, pouring drinks and laughing with a group of regulars. There was no sign of Claire. Nate's stomach twisted as he walked toward the counter, the realization hitting him harder than he had expected. Tim was the one who had taken his place. Tim looked up and smiled when he saw Nate approaching. There was no recognition in Tim's eyes, just that same confident, almost smug expression he always wore. "Nate, right?" he greeted, wiping his hands on a bar towel. "What's up, man? Haven't seen you in here before." Nate didn't respond to the casual greeting. Instead, he leaned across the bar, his gaze locked on Tim's. "I need to talk to you, now." Tim's smile faltered for a second, but only a second. He recovered quickly, sliding a glass toward a waiting customer. "Sure, man. What's going on?" Nate's fists clenched by his sides. He didn't want to waste time. "I know what's been happening between you and Claire." The words landed between them with the force of a punch. Tim's face remained unreadable, but Nate could see the slightest shift in his posture, like a door that had just cracked open, revealing a glimpse of something hidden behind it. For a moment, Tim didn't say anything, and Nate took a step forward, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm not stupid," Nate continued. "I know you've been seeing her, and I'm done pretending that it doesn't matter." Tim leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the bar. He didn't seem surprised, but then again, Nate had never expected him to be. "I get it," Tim said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "It's not a great situation, I know, but you have to understand, Nate. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Claire and we didn't plan on it going this far." The words stung more than Nate had anticipated. "Then why did you do it?" he spat, the anger rising in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell her what it was?" Tim's eyes softened for a moment and he sighed. "It was never meant to hurt you, man, I swear, but Claire, she's different. I don't know how to explain it. There's something between us." The admission hit Nate like a slap to the face. The raw honesty in Tim's voice felt like betrayal, like he was confessing to something as if it were inevitable. "You don't get it," Nate said, his voice hoarse now. "She's my wife, Tim. She's my life. You had no right to come in and take her away from me." Tim didn't flinch. Instead, he stared at Nate, his expression no longer amused. "I'm not here to take her from you, Nate. That's not what happened. But what I can tell you is that she needed something from me that you couldn't give her, something she wasn't getting from you." Nate's world seemed to tilt for a moment. "You think I didn't try?" His voice cracked as the frustration boiled over. "You think I didn't give her everything I had? I spent years building a life with her, and you just took her?" Tim's eyes softened with something that resembled pity. "It's not like that. We all make choices, Nate, and we live with the consequences." Nate felt his heart break with a pain he couldn't describe. He hadn't been prepared for this. He hadn't been prepared for the truth of what Tim was saying, what Claire had said in her own way when she admitted she needed more. She needed freedom, a freedom he couldn't give her, a freedom she had found in another man. For a moment, the bar seemed to spin around him. Nate staggered slightly, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "You didn't love her," Nate whispered, more to himself than to Tim. "You were just using her." Tim leaned forward now, his voice low. "I did love her, Nate, more than you know. But you have to understand something. I didn't come into this to hurt you. I didn't know how deep it was until it was too late." The weight of Tim's words seemed to crush the air out of the room. Nate's mind raced. He had always known this day would come, but he hadn't expected it to feel so final, so irreversible. "I've had enough, Tim," Nate said quietly, finally meeting Tim's eyes. "I'm done, with both of you." He turned away and walked out of the bar, leaving Tim behind, his world crumbling further with each step. The cold air hit Nate as he stepped outside, his breath visible in the night. He had left Tim's bar and walked aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of everything he had learned. His mind was a whirlwind, but beneath it all was one undeniable truth. His life was no longer what it had been. The man he had been, strong, trusting, content in his relationship with Claire, felt like a distant memory. The walk home was torturous, each step feeling heavier than the last. His chest ached with a mix of anger and heartbreak, but what struck him most was the numbness. It was like he was walking through a fog, unable to see what was ahead, but knowing it would only get worse. Every step led him further away from the life he had built, further into the wreckage of his marriage. When he finally reached the house, he hesitated at the door, unsure of what to do next. Everything inside felt foreign, as if Claire's absence had already made the house unrecognizable. He pushed open the door, the familiar creak echoing in the stillness. The house was quiet, too quiet. He knew she was in the bedroom, knew she had been waiting for him to come back. The moment they had shared earlier, the last time they had really talked, was still fresh in his mind. She had apologized. She had begged him to understand, but those words had no weight now. Not anymore. Nate walked toward the bedroom, the weight of the moment making each step feel like it took forever. He stopped just inside the doorway, leaning against the frame as he watched Claire sit on the bed. She had her head down, her hands in her lap. Her posture, her entire being was one of defeat. "Where were you?" Claire's voice was soft, but it hit Nate like a sharp blade. He stared at her for a long moment, gathering his thoughts, but his emotions were a jumble. "I went to see Tim," he said finally, the words feeling cold as they left his lips. "I wanted to hear it from him. I wanted to know the truth." Claire's face paled. She didn't say anything, but Nate saw the shift in her, something dark, something heavy. Her silence spoke volumes. "I'm done with the lies, Claire," Nate continued, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm done pretending that everything's okay. I know now, everything I've been blind to all this time. The affair, the deceit, it's all out in the open." Claire stood up, her face flushed with emotion. "Nate, please. I didn't want this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe that." The desperation in her voice made his stomach churn, but he couldn't let it move him, not this time. "You hurt me more than you know," Nate said, his voice trembling. "I've spent the last few days trying to figure out what went wrong, what I could have done differently, and now I know. It wasn't me, Claire. It was you. You made the choice." Claire reached out toward him, her hands trembling. "Nate, I'm sorry. Don't," he interrupted, stepping back, feeling a wave of disgust rise in his chest. "Don't apologize anymore. I don't need your apologies. I need you to understand the cost of what you've done." He could see the pain in her eyes, but it was too late for that. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It wasn't just the affair with Tim. It was the realization that she had never really been honest with him. They had both been living in a lie, and now that lie was shattered. "Do you think I can ever trust you again?" Nate asked, his voice low but steady. "After everything? After what you've done?" Claire's breath hitched and tears welled in her eyes. "I never wanted this to happen. I didn't want to lose you. Please, just give me another chance." Her pleading felt like a knife to his heart, but it wasn't enough to make him forget what she had taken from him. The trust, the love, the security they had once shared, gone in a moment of weakness, of selfishness. "I can't, Claire," he said quietly. "I can't go back to that. You broke something in me that I don't think can ever be fixed." Claire's hands fell to her sides as if the weight of his words had physically drained her. She looked at him with such raw pain, but it didn't change anything. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. "I never meant for it to go this far," Claire whispered, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I know," Nate replied softly, "but it did. And now I have to move on. From everything." Claire didn't say anything. She didn't move. The silence that fell between them was the loudest thing in the room, and Nate could feel it echoing in his chest, the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. Nate turned and walked out of the room, leaving Claire standing there, as broken as he felt inside. The courthouse was cold, the sterile walls closing in on Nate as he sat in the waiting area, nervously flipping through the papers in his hands. The reality of it all hit him in waves. This was it. The end of everything he had known for so many years. The marriage that had once seemed unbreakable was now nothing more than a legal formality. The silence in the room was suffocating. Other people came and went. Couples, families, individuals, all sitting in this same waiting space for their own reasons. But for Nate, it felt like the entire world had paused just for him. He had spent countless sleepless nights replaying every moment of his marriage, wondering where things had gone wrong. Had he missed the signs? Was there something he could have done differently? But deep down, Nate knew that the truth was simpler than that. Claire had chosen this. She had chosen to break everything, and now it was time to face the consequences. A woman in a navy blue suit called his name, and he stood, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He followed her down a narrow hallway into a small, sterile office. The room was as unwelcoming as the courthouse itself, filled with the smell of paper and the faint hum of a fluorescent light overhead. Claire was already there, sitting on the other side of the desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked as exhausted as he felt, but there was no sign of the warmth that once defined her. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying, but she didn't look up when he entered. She had nothing left to say, just like him. There were no more words to be exchanged. The divorce papers sat between them, a cold reminder of the distance that had grown between them. Nate could see the line for the signatures, the last step that would officially erase everything they had built together. It felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. This wasn't how he had imagined his future. He had never thought it would come to this. The lawyer, a woman in her late 40s, looked up from her desk. "Mr. McAllister, Miss McAllister, are you both ready to proceed?" she asked, her voice devoid of any emotion. Nate glanced at Claire, who nodded slowly, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Nate swallowed hard, nodding in return. He was ready. He had to be. There was no point in fighting anymore. The battle had been lost the moment Claire had chosen someone else. The lawyer continued, her voice sounding distant and detached as she explained the process. How they would sign the papers, how everything would be finalized in a few weeks. Nate heard the words, but they felt hollow. There was nothing left to salvage. No promises of healing, no hopes of reconciliation. All that remained was the cold paperwork in front of him. Claire picked up her pen first. She hesitated for a moment before signing her name, the ink barely visible on the paper as she dragged the pen across the line. She didn't look at him when she did it. She couldn't. The finality of it was too much. But Nate knew the truth. This wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of everything they had once shared. When it was his turn, Nate took the pen, his fingers shaking as he held it above the paper. He had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, it felt like a betrayal of everything he had believed in. How had they gotten here? How had the love he once had for Claire slipped away so easily? He signed his name with a steady hand, the weight of the decision sinking in. There was no turning back now. The lawyer nodded, marking the last line of the paper with her own signature. "The divorce is now finalized," she said, her voice clinically detached. "You'll both receive copies of the paperwork within the next week." Nate felt the finality of her words like a punch to the gut. He didn't know what to feel, relief, anger, sadness. It was all a blur, but there was one thing he did know. It was over. Claire stood up slowly, her eyes still not meeting his. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible. But there was no emotion in them, no feeling, just emptiness. Nate didn't reply. He couldn't. The words he wanted to say, the ones that would make everything right, didn't exist. There was nothing left to fix. Without another word, Claire walked out of the office, her back straight, her steps slow but steady. She was leaving, and so was he. They were both moving on to lives that no longer intersected, two strangers living in the ruins of a marriage that had once meant everything. Nate watched her go, feeling the weight of her absence. He had loved her. He had fought for her. But in the end he was left standing alone, holding the remnants of what was. As he walked out of the courthouse, the air outside felt cold and unfamiliar. For the first time in a long while, Nate felt the weight of freedom, but it was a freedom that came at a terrible cost. His marriage was over, and there was no going back. It had been a year since the divorce was finalized, a year of silent nights, of moments spent staring at the empty side of the bed, the quiet loneliness settling in like a second skin. Nate's life had slowly begun to find its new rhythm, but the ache, oh, that ache, never quite left him. He'd thrown himself into work, into distractions, into anything that could push the thoughts of Claire, of their broken marriage, to the back of his mind. But those memories were like a ghost that refused to leave. The laughter they shared, the quiet mornings with coffee, the way she had once touched him, held him, those things were buried beneath the cold reality of what they had become. Nate sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of paperwork in front of him. Legal documents, tax forms, receipts from the past year. The mundane was a lifeline now, something to focus on, something that kept his mind from wandering back to Claire. He had been careful to avoid places they used to go, avoided running into their mutual friends, and he hadn't seen her since the day they signed the divorce papers. The sound of his phone ringing pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, a wave of hesitation hitting him when he saw the name. Claire. He hadn't heard from her in months, not since the final weeks of the divorce proceedings, not since she had walked out of his life for good. He stared at the phone for a moment, weighing the decision in his head. His hand hovered over the answer button, but he hesitated. Why now? What could she possibly want? With a sigh, he accepted the call, bringing the phone to his ear. Nate? Claire's voice was soft, almost fragile, a stark contrast to the woman who had once been so certain of everything. Claire, Nate replied, his voice colder than he intended. He couldn't help it. Her name still carried the weight of all the pain they had gone through together. I know it's been a long time, Claire said quietly, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to talk to you about everything. Nate felt a flicker of something. Was it anger or just the old familiar hurt? He tried to hold on to the calm he'd worked so hard to maintain, but it slipped through his fingers. What could you possibly say that hasn't already been said? Nate asked, his voice flat. You made your choice, Claire. You chose him. You chose the affair, the lies, the deceit. I don't know what else is left to discuss. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice cracked slightly. I know, and I deserve everything you're saying, but it's not about that, Nate. It's about me, about what I did to you, to us. The words hit him like a slap. He hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected that. Claire had always been the one to push the blame onto him, to avoid confronting her own role in their downfall. To hear her admit that she had broken him, broken them, was almost too much. You've had a year, Claire, Nate said, his voice trembling now. A year to figure out what you want, to live with the consequences of what you did. And now you're calling me? Why? To make yourself feel better? To say things you should have said before? There was no answer at first, only the sound of Claire's shallow breaths on the other end. Then she spoke again, her words barely above a whisper. I was selfish. I was so caught up in what I thought I needed, that I lost sight of what mattered. I lost you, and I'll never get you back. Nate felt his throat tighten, and he had to swallow hard to keep himself composed. You don't get it, do you? He asked, his voice raw now, the hurt spilling out. You didn't just leave me, Claire. You left everything we built. You destroyed everything. And now you're standing here asking for what? Forgiveness? You don't deserve it. Not after everything. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. He could hear Claire's soft sobs, the pain in her voice as she tried to speak. But Nate wasn't ready to hear her apologies anymore. He was done. I've had enough, he said, his voice trembling with the weight of his words. You had your chance. You threw it away. Don't call me again. He hung up the phone before she could respond, his hand shaking slightly as he placed it back on the table. He sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, the quiet stillness of the room wrapping around him like a shroud. It was over. He had said the words. He had finally let go. But as the weight of the silence settled around him, Nate knew that letting go didn't mean the pain was gone. It didn't mean that everything would be okay. It just meant that he had to move forward. And he would, one step at a time. The house felt emptier than ever. It had been months since the divorce, and yet the walls still carried the echoes of laughter, arguments, and shared dreams. Those memories were fading, replaced by a silence that seemed to grow louder each day. Nate stood in front of the window, staring out at the street below. It was a cold evening, the chill of the winter air creeping through the cracks. He could feel it, the finality of everything that had happened, the end of his marriage, the end of his past. He had spent so much time fighting against it, clinging to what he thought he had lost. But now, standing here in the quiet of his life, he realized that the real loss wasn't the marriage. It was the part of himself he had given away in the process. A year ago, he couldn't have imagined a life without Claire. They had built something together. But now, as time passed, he saw that the life he had been living wasn't one he wanted anymore. The version of himself that had existed with her, devoted, trusting, and blind to the cracks in their relationship, was gone. What remained was someone who had learned painfully how to let go. The phone buzzed in his pocket. Nate pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name. Claire. It had been weeks since he last heard from her. He had expected this moment to come, this final contact, the last attempt to reopen old wounds. He stared at the screen for a long moment before answering, unsure of what he would hear, unsure of what he would feel. Hello? His voice sounded strange to his own ears, strained, distant, and yet softer than he thought it would be. Nate. Claire's voice was barely a whisper, fragile and uncertain. I didn't expect you to pick up. I've been thinking a lot about everything. The words she spoke had lost their power long ago, but something in her tone made Nate pause. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just a hollow sadness, a regret that hung in the air like an unspoken apology. I don't know what you expect from me, Claire, Nate replied, the distance between them stretching further with each word. You made your choice, and I made mine. There's nothing left to say. He could hear her breathing, the silence stretching between them like a rope pulling taut. She finally spoke again, her voice barely audible, as though the weight of the words she was about to say might break her. I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry. I know I can never fix what I broke, but I wish I had done things differently. I never wanted to hurt you, Nate. The apology hung in the air, and Nate felt the familiar rush of emotions threaten to overtake him. It would have been so easy to fall back into the cycle of guilt, anger, and pain. But he knew that wasn't what he needed anymore. He had carried the burden of their past for long enough. You can't fix this, Nate said quietly, and I don't need you to apologize anymore. You've already done enough damage, we both have. Claire's silence on the other end of the line said everything. The regret, the sorrow, it all settled between them. The truth of their situation had never been clearer. I've moved on, Claire, Nate continued, his voice steady now, a finality in his words that he hadn't expected to feel. I've let go of what we were. It's not easy, but I'm learning to live with it. Claire's voice trembled. I never thought you would be able to move on. I never thought we'd end like this. Nate's heart softened, but only for a moment. We don't get to decide how things end, Claire. We just have to accept it. There was a long pause before she spoke again, quieter now. I hope you find peace, Nate. Truly. Nate closed his eyes, the weight of everything finally sinking in. I already have, he said, the words feeling like a weight lifted from his chest. Goodbye, Claire. He hung up the phone without waiting for a response, the finality of the action settling in. For the first time in a long while, Nate felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had accepted what had happened. He had accepted the loss, the betrayal, the pain. And with that acceptance, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a year. Freedom. It wasn't the freedom he had once imagined, but it was the freedom he needed. The freedom to rebuild, to move forward without looking back. Nate walked to the window and looked out at the world beyond. The city was alive with the hum of people, of life moving forward, of people letting go and starting again. He was ready to start again too,